The bank came to take Elias Mercer's ranch at sunrise, but before the papers could be signed, a telegraph rider appeared through the dust carrying news so impossible that even the banker forgot how to speak. The debt was gone. Every cent of it. 12 hours earlier, Elias Mercer had been sitting alone beside a dying fire with exactly 2 bowls of stew left in the house. One for himself, one for his little girl. Winter had settled hard across western Kansas that year, cold enough to crack fence posts and freeze water solid inside the troughs before dawn. The kind of cold that made poor men quieter. Elias sat at the rough wooden table with his sleeves rolled down over tired hands scarred by years of ranch work that no longer paid enough to matter. Across from him, Clara Mercer pretended not to notice how little meat remained in the pot. She was 10 years old and already learning the dangerous habit of acting full when she was still hungry. The stew smelled thin. Mostly beans. Mostly broth. Just enough salt to fool the stomach for another night. Wind rattled the loose boards outside while snow drifted across the prairie in pale sheets beneath the moonlight. Elias looked toward the folded bank notice sitting beside the lantern. Final collection. The words seemed darker every time he read them. Mr. Whitmore from the bank had promised he would arrive by morning with 2 deputies and legal papers ready for signing. 7 years of debt. 7 years of drought, dead cattle, and bad harvests. All ending before noon tomorrow. Clara pushed her bowl slightly toward her father. "I ain't too hungry tonight," she whispered softly. Elias forced a smile he didn't feel. "Nice try." He slid the bowl back toward her. "Growing girls eat first." She lowered her eyes. Outside, somewhere beyond the barn, a horse gave a nervous cry against the wind. Then came 3 slow knocks against the front door. Not loud, not desperate, just heavy enough to make both of them freeze. Elias stared toward the entrance while the fire popped softly behind him. Nobody visited ranches this far out after dark unless they were lost, dying, or dangerous. Another knock came. Clara's small fingers tightened. Around her spoon, Elias stood slowly, every floorboard creaking beneath his boots. His old rifle leaned against the wall nearby, though he didn't reach for it yet. He moved toward the door and pulled it open against the screaming wind. A man stood beneath the storm wrapped in a dark wool blanket dusted white with snow. Patchy, tall, older. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion. One side of his coat was stained dark from melted snow and blood. The stranger's breathing came slow and uneven, steam rising into the frozen air between them. But it wasn't the blood that caught Elias's attention. It was the man's eyes, calm, proud, tired beyond words. The stranger looked past Elias toward the warmth inside the cabin, then quietly asked, "Do you have water?" Elias glanced back at the table. 2 bowls. 1 dying fire. Nothing left after tonight. The wind howled across the prairie like something alive. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Elias stepped aside from the doorway and said the words that would change everything by sunrise. "Come in before the cold buries us both." The stranger stepped inside slowly, carrying the smell of snow, wet leather, and cold mountain wind into the tiny cabin. Melted frost dripped from the edges of his blanket onto the wooden floorboards near the doorway. Clara watched him carefully from the table, her spoon frozen halfway to her mouth. The man removed his gloves with stiff fingers darkened by winter and lowered himself near the fire without a word. Elias closed the door against the storm and slid the iron lock into place. Outside, the prairie vanished beneath blowing white dust and darkness. Inside, the room felt smaller somehow, quieter. The Apache man held his hands toward the weak flames, though his eyes never stopped studying the room around him. The cracked walls, the patched curtains, the empty shelves, a ranch house stripped down to survival. Elias could tell the stranger understood poverty the moment he saw it. Clara finally broke the silence first. "You are hurt," she whispered. The man glanced down toward the blood on his coat and answered calmly, "Only tired." His voice carried the deep roughness of gravel roads and old winters. Elias walked toward the stove and lifted the nearly empty pot from the fire. The bottom scraped dry when he stirred it. He hesitated for only a second before grabbing the 3rd bowl hanging from the wall. Clara noticed immediately. So did the stranger. The old Apache man looked at the tiny amount left in the pot and slowly shook his head. No, he said quietly. Your family needs it. Elias kept pouring anyway. Thin broth. A few beans. One small piece of potato floating near the top. He handed the bowl over without speaking. The stranger accepted it carefully, like something valuable had just been placed into his hands. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Only the sound of spoons against pottery and the wind pressing against the cabin walls. Elias sat beside the lantern, staring at the bank notice folded near his elbow. He could almost hear Whitmore's voice already. Cold, polite, final. Sunrise, Mercer. Either the money is there or the ranch belongs to the bank. 7 years ago, Elias had borrowed $800 to survive a drought that killed half his herd. Then came another dry season. Then sickness through the cattle. Then the railroad bypassed their county entirely, leaving ranchers stranded miles from decent trade routes. Debt piled slowly out here, quietly, like snow against a fence line. The stranger finished half his stew and suddenly stopped eating. He looked toward Clara's nearly empty bowl, then toward Elias, who had not touched his own portion yet. You gave away your supper, the Apache man said softly. Elias shrugged without lifting his eyes. A hungry traveler showed up at my door. Most men would have sent me back into the storm. Elias finally looked at him then. Most men still got something left worth protecting. Silence settled again. The fire cracked softly beneath the kettle. Clara leaned closer to the warmth while snow hissed against the windows. The stranger reached slowly beneath his coat and pulled free a small leather pouch tied tightly with worn cord. He kept one hand resting over it for a moment before setting it carefully beside his boot. The pouch landed heavier than Elias expected. Metal clinked faintly from inside. Coins maybe, or something else. Elias noticed immediately but forced himself to look away. Out here, a man survived longer when he respected another man's secrets. The stranger watched him closely after that. Not suspicious, curious, like he had expected greed and found something else instead. Then, after a long silence, the Apache man spoke again while staring into the fire. Tomorrow, he said quietly, your life changes. The words stayed in the cabin long after the stranger stopped speaking. Your life changes. Elias Mercer had heard desperate men say strange things before. Dying soldiers during the war. Drunk miners passing through town. Travelers half frozen from mountain storms. But something about the old Apache man's voice unsettled him in a way he could not explain. It was not hope. It sounded too certain for hope. The fire burned lower as midnight crept across the prairie. Clara had fallen asleep beneath a wool blanket beside the stove, one hand still curled near her empty bowl. The stranger sat quietly across from her, watching the flames move behind the iron grate. Snow continued piling against the outside walls in heavy waves, covering the ranch inch by inch beneath the darkness. Elias reached for another piece of wood beside the fireplace and noticed the Apache man staring at the folded bank notice again. Debt? The stranger asked quietly. Elias nodded once. By tomorrow afternoon, this ranch belongs to Whitmore Bank. The old man studied him carefully. And still you shared your food. Elias dropped the log into the fire. Sparks floated upward in soft orange bursts. A man who only helps people when life is easy is not much of a man. The stranger lowered his eyes after that. Silence returned. But this time it felt heavier somehow. An hour later, the storm outside finally weakened enough for the wind to settle into a low distant howl across the plains. Elias stood and walked toward the window near the table. Moonlight reflected off endless white snowdrifts stretching across his land. Fences nearly buried. Barn roof covered thick. Somewhere out there, his remaining cattle huddled together against the cold waiting for another hard morning. He rubbed tired fingers across his beard and quietly said, Truth is, I do not even know why I keep fighting for this place anymore. Behind him, the Apache man answered without hesitation. Because your wife is buried here. Elias froze. Slowly, he turned back toward the fire. The stranger remained seated exactly where he had been, calm as still water. How did you know that? The old man glanced toward the small shelf above the fireplace. A faded photograph rested there beside a dried wildflower pressed inside a cracked glass frame. Elias and a smiling woman standing beside this very ranch years ago before drought and debt hollowed everything out. The way you look at the land, the Apache man said softly. Only grieving men hold onto dying places that hard. Elias felt something tighten painfully in his chest. He had not spoken Abigail's name aloud in months. Not since the fever took her during the previous winter. Even Clara rarely mentioned her anymore because silence hurt less than remembering. The old man slowly reached down beside his boot and untied the leather pouch. For the first time, Elias heard the full weight of what rested inside. Coins. A great many of them. Gold by the sound. The stranger opened the pouch just enough for firelight to spill across stacks of gold eagles inside. More money than Elias had seen in years. His breath caught instantly. One handful of those coins could save the ranch by morning. Maybe all of it. The stranger watched his face carefully, then pushed the pouch slightly forward across the floorboards. Not an offer. A test. Elias stared at the gold for several long seconds while the fire crackled softly between them. He thought about Clara sleeping hungry, about Whitmore arriving at dawn, about 7 years of failure crushing him inch by inch. His hand slowly tightened against his knee. Then he pushed the pouch gently back toward the stranger without touching a single coin. You should keep that hidden, Elias said quietly. Men kill each other over less. The old Apache man looked at him for a very long time after that. Then, for the first time all night, he smiled. The smile changed the old man's face completely. Until then, he had looked carved from winter itself. Hard lines, quiet eyes, the kind of face that belonged to someone who had buried more people than he could remember. But now something warmer appeared beneath the exhaustion. Respect. He pulled the leather pouch back toward himself and carefully tied the cord shut again before slipping it beneath his coat. Elias exhaled slowly and leaned back into his chair. He did not trust money that arrived during storms. Out on the frontier, unexpected gold usually came tied to unexpected graves. The fire had nearly burned down to glowing coals when the old Apache man finally spoke again. My name is Dakota. Elias nodded once. Elias Mercer. Dakota glanced toward the sleeping girl beside the stove. And she is your heart. Elias looked toward Clara wrapped tightly beneath the blanket Abigail had sewn years earlier. One corner was torn now. The stitching faded. But Clara still slept with it every night. She is all I got left, Elias answered quietly. Dakota studied him for a moment before reaching slowly beneath his coat again. This time he removed something smaller than the pouch. A silver pocket watch worn smooth with age. He turned it carefully in his weathered hands while staring into the firelight. My father carried this for 40 years, he said softly. He once told me a man learns another man's true nature when hunger enters the room. Elias listened without speaking. Dakota opened the watch and smiled faintly at whatever memory rested inside it. Most men become smaller when life takes everything away. They clutch what little remains until their hands close around emptiness. He lifted his eyes toward Elias. But sometimes a man becomes larger. Wind pressed softly against the cabin walls while the lantern flickered low beside the bank notice. Elias rubbed his tired jaw and gave a dry laugh. I do not feel larger these days. Dakota nodded slowly. That is because good men rarely see themselves clearly. The words settled deep inside the quiet room. Elias was not used to kindness from strangers anymore, especially not after the last few years. Neighbors stopped visiting poor ranchers eventually. People avoided desperation because they feared catching it themselves. Even church conversations changed once a man started missing loan payments. Elias remembered the way folks in town looked at him now. Not cruel. Worse than cruel. Sorry. He hated pity more than hunger. Dakota suddenly looked toward the dark window beside the table. Someone follows me. Elias stiffened immediately. What do you mean? Dakota listened silently for a moment before answering. 3 riders. Maybe 4. They were behind me before the storm. Elias stood and moved carefully toward the window. Outside, the snow still drifted heavily beneath pale moonlight. Nothing moved near the barn or fence line. No lanterns, no horses, just white prairie stretching endless and cold beneath the night sky. I do not see anybody. Dakota nodded once. Not yet. The old Apache man slowly pushed himself to his feet, though pain crossed his face for the first time all night. Elias noticed the dark stain spreading wider beneath Dakota's coat near his ribs. You need rest, Elias said. Dakota ignored the comment and stepped closer to the fire instead. If riders come by morning, he said quietly, you must tell them nothing. Elias frowned. Depends what they are asking. Dakota looked directly into his eyes then. Calm, steady. Even if they offer enough money to save this ranch. The room went still after that. Elias could hear Clara breathing softly beside the stove. Could hear the kettle trembling faintly above the dying coals. Dakota reached into his pocket once more and removed a folded piece of paper sealed tightly inside oilcloth. He stared at it for several long seconds before placing it carefully onto the table beside the lantern. If I do not wake tomorrow, he said softly, burn this before sunrise. Elias looked down at the paper, then back at Dakota. What is it? Dakota's eyes drifted toward the storm outside. The reason men are hunting me through winter. Sleep never truly came to Elias Mercer that night. He remained seated near the fire long after Dakota stretched beneath an old blanket beside the wall. The folded paper stayed on the table between them like something alive. Burn this before sunrise. The words echoed through Elias's mind while the storm slowly drifted east across the prairie. Sometime near dawn, the wind finally quieted enough for the ranch house to settle into silence. No creaking shutters, no rattling boards, just the low crackle of dying embers and Clara breathing softly in her sleep. Elias rubbed tired hands across his face and stared again toward the folded oilcloth packet. Every instinct told him not to touch another man's secrets. But another voice whispered louder now. $800. One piece of paper. One hard winter away from losing everything forever. He hated himself for even thinking it. Slowly, he stood from the chair and walked toward the table. The lantern beside the paper burned low and golden against the darkness. Dakota remained motionless near the wall, though Elias could not tell whether the old man truly slept or merely pretended to. Elias rested one rough hand beside the folded packet but did not open it. Instead, his eyes drifted toward Dakota's coat hanging near the stove. The leather pouch remained hidden inside. Gold enough to erase 7 years of failure. Gold enough to buy cattle, seed, feed, medicine for Clara if she ever got sick again. He looked toward his daughter sleeping beneath her mother's blanket and felt shame rise heavy in his chest. Poverty changed men slowly, not all at once. First it stole comfort, then pride, then pieces of conscience, one compromise at a time. Elias pulled his hand away from the paper and stepped back from the table. No, he whispered quietly to himself. The floorboard creaked beneath his boot. Behind him, Dakota's voice emerged softly from the darkness. The hardest battles leave no blood behind. Elias turned sharply. The old Apache man had not moved, but his eyes were open now, reflecting faint orange firelight. Elias let out a slow breath through his nose. You always talk like a fortune cookie carved itself into a mountain? For the first time, Dakota gave a quiet laugh. Dry, low, human. My grandfather talked too much. Some of it stayed inside me. Elias sat down again beside the fire while dawn slowly crept gray against the frozen windows. Outside, snowdrifts glowed pale beneath the coming morning. Dakota studied the exhausted rancher carefully before speaking again. You looked at the gold. Elias nodded honestly. I did. And Elias stared into the weak flames. And for a few seconds I hated the kind of man I almost became. Silence settled gently after that. Not heavy this time. Honest. Dakota reached toward the pocket watch in his hands and slowly closed it with a soft click. That is why your life changes today, he said quietly. Before Elias could answer, the distant sound of horses drifted across the frozen prairie. Both men looked toward the window instantly. Hoofbeats. Several riders. Clara stirred awake near the stove while Elias stood quickly and moved toward the door. Through the frosted glass, he could barely make out dark figures approaching through the morning snow. 3 riders. No, 4. One carried a lantern swinging beside the saddle. Another wore the long black coat Elias recognized immediately even from a distance. Whitmore. The banker had arrived earlier than expected. Elias felt his stomach sink hard. Dakota rose slowly despite the pain crossing his face. "They cannot see me here," he said quietly. Elias glanced back toward him. "Who are the others?" Dakota listened carefully to the approaching horses before answering. "Not bankmen." The hoofbeats grew louder outside. Then came a sharp knock against the front door, while dawn light spilled cold and gray across the cabin floor. Whitmore's voice followed through the wood. "Morning, Mercer. Open up. We have business to finish." The knocking came again. Harder this time. Not angry. Certain. The kind of knock made by men who believed the law already stood beside them. Elias glanced toward Dakota while Clara sat upright beneath her blanket, eyes wide with fear and confusion. The old Apache man moved quietly despite his injury and stepped toward the back corner of the cabin where shadows from the dying fire covered the wall. He pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders and disappeared into darkness so completely that Clara nearly lost sight of him. Elias stared for a second longer, still amazed how a man his age could vanish inside a one-room cabin. Another knock shook the door. "Mercer," Whitmore called again from outside. "I know you are in there." Elias opened the door slowly against the cold morning wind. Snow crunched beneath heavy boots outside where 4 riders waited beside the porch. Whitmore sat stiff and proper atop a gray horse wrapped in an expensive wool coat untouched by hard labor. Beside him stood 2 deputies with badges pinned over thick winter jackets. The 4th rider was unfamiliar. Tall, narrow face, black gloves, eyes too sharp for a banker's company. Elias noticed immediately how the stranger scanned the ranch instead of the house, like he was searching for something hidden. Whitmore removed one glove carefully and offered a thin smile. "Morning, Mercer. Rough night for visitors." Elias stepped halfway outside and pulled the door shut behind him. "What do you want done this early?" Whitmore adjusted the papers beneath his arm. "Business does not wait for sunshine." The unfamiliar rider suddenly spoke. His voice carried the smooth calm of someone dangerous enough to never raise it. "We are looking for an Apache traveler. Older man. Wounded." Elias kept his face still. "I have not seen anybody." The man studied him for several quiet seconds. Then his eyes drifted toward the barn, the fences, the snow near the porch steps. Elias realized what worried him immediately. Tracks. But the storm during the night had buried nearly everything beneath fresh snow. Whitmore cleared his throat awkwardly. "As I was saying, Mercer, unless payment appears this morning, ownership of the ranch transfers officially to Whitmore Bank by noon." Elias nodded once. No anger left anymore. Just exhaustion. "I know the terms." The unfamiliar rider dismounted slowly from his horse and stepped closer to the porch. His boots crushed frozen snow beneath them with deliberate patience. "You are certain nobody came through here last night?" Elias looked directly into the man's eyes. Storm was too heavy for travelers. The stranger stared at him another moment before smiling faintly. Not friendly. Interested. "You are either honest," he said softly, "or loyal." Before Elias could answer, the distant sound of another horse echoed across the prairie. Fast, very fast. Everyone turned at once toward the eastern ridge where snow blew behind a lone rider racing hard across the frozen land. The rider waved something overhead while shouting before he even reached the ranch. "Telegram for Whitmore Bank." The horse nearly stumbled climbing the final drift toward the house. The young messenger leaped down breathless and shoved a sealed envelope toward Whitmore with freezing fingers. "Came from Wichita before dawn," he gasped. "Said immediate delivery." Whitmore frowned and broke the seal impatiently while snow whipped around his boots. Elias watched the banker's expression carefully. First annoyance, then confusion, then something colder. The color slowly drained from Whitmore's face as his eyes moved down the page. One of the deputies leaned closer. "What is it?" Whitmore lowered the paper slowly without speaking. His mouth opened once but no words came out. The unfamiliar rider stepped forward sharply. "What happened?" Whitmore looked toward Elias Mercer like he had never truly seen the rancher before that moment. "The debt," he whispered faintly. "Every dollar paid in full." Silence crashed across the snowy ranch. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. Elias stared at him without breathing. "What?" Whitmore looked back down at the telegram as though the letters themselves frightened him. Payment arrived through First Territory Bank before sunrise. His voice shook slightly now. "Anonymous transfer. Complete settlement." Clara opened the cabin door behind Elias just enough to peek outside into the frozen morning. Whitmore slowly folded the telegram with stiff fingers while the unfamiliar rider's eyes narrowed dangerously. Then the stranger asked the question that changed everything. "Who exactly are you hiding in that house, Mercer?" The question hung in the frozen air while snow drifted softly across the ranch yard. Elias could feel Clara standing behind him in the doorway, clutching the edge of his coat with small trembling fingers. Whitmore remained silent beside his horse, still staring at the telegram like a man who had just watched the laws of nature bend in front of him. The unfamiliar rider never took his eyes off Elias. Calm eyes, hunting eyes. Elias swallowed once and answered carefully. "Nobody you need to concern yourself with." The man smiled faintly again, though this time there was no warmth behind it at all. "That usually means somebody important." Before Elias could reply, the cabin door creaked wider behind him. Dakota stepped out slowly into the pale morning light. The old Apache man stood straight despite the exhaustion in his face, one hand resting calmly against the porch rail while snowflakes settled across his dark hair and blanket. The moment the stranger saw him, every trace of calm vanished from his expression. "There you are," he said quietly. One of the deputies shifted uneasily beside Whitmore. Even the horses seemed restless now. Dakota looked directly at the stranger and spoke with the same steady voice he had used all night. "You traveled very far for something that does not belong to you, Malcolm Reed." Elias glanced sharply toward the black-coated rider. Malcolm Reed slowly removed one glove finger by finger without looking away from Dakota. "I traveled far because some papers disappeared from a stagecoach 3 weeks ago." Dakota stepped carefully down from the porch. "Those papers were stolen before they ever reached the stagecoach." Reed's jaw tightened slightly. "And now they are missing again." Elias suddenly remembered the folded packet resting inside the cabin beside the lantern. The reason men were hunting Dakota through winter. Reed noticed the realization crossing Elias's face immediately. "Ah," he said softly. "So the rancher knows now." Clara tightened her grip on Elias's sleeve. Dakota ignored Reed completely and instead looked toward Whitmore. "Tell him who sent the payment." Whitmore hesitated visibly. I only received the transfer notice." "Read the sender." Whitmore unfolded the telegram again with stiff fingers and cleared his throat nervously. "Payment authorized through First Territory Bank under the seal of the Red River Apache Council Treasury." One deputy blinked hard in confusion. "Apache Treasury?" Whitmore nodded slowly. "Amount transferred exceeds $800 by nearly 3 times." Elias stared at Dakota in disbelief. The old man met his eyes calmly. "I told you your life changes today." Reed stepped forward through the snow then, his voice colder now. "You think paying one ranch debt makes this noble?" Dakota finally turned toward him fully. "No, but it rewards goodness before greed destroys it." Reed laughed once beneath his breath. "Goodness." He looked toward Elias with open disbelief. "You fed a stranger one bowl of stew and suddenly you are part of something much larger than yourself. Rancher." Elias frowned. "What exactly is going on?" Dakota reached slowly beneath his blanket and removed the silver pocket watch again. "For 20 years, he said quietly. Certain men have stolen treaty gold meant for reservations and blamed the disappearances on tribes too poor to fight the accusations. Reed's face darkened instantly. Dakota continued speaking anyway. 3 weeks ago, proof finally surfaced. Names, signatures, bank transfers. Elias felt cold settle deep into his stomach. The folded paper inside the cabin was not money. It was evidence. Reed's eyes shifted toward the cabin door behind Elias. You should have burned the paper when he told you. Elias looked back at him carefully. Maybe I still will. Dakota smiled faintly beside the porch. No, he said softly. You will not. Snow drifted silently between them while the morning sun finally broke pale gold across the frozen prairie. Then, from somewhere beyond the western ridge, another sound rose through the cold air. Horses. Many horses. Not for this time. Dozens. Reed heard them too. For the first time since arriving, uncertainty crossed his face. The sound rolling across the prairie did not feel like approaching danger. It felt older than that. Heavier. Elias stepped off the porch slowly, snow crunching beneath his boots while every man in the yard turned toward the western ridge. Through the pale morning light, riders began appearing one by one against the drifting snow. Dark horses, long blankets moving in the wind, silent figures crossing the frozen land with steady purpose. Not a charge, not a raid, something calmer, something far more controlled. Clara stepped out beside her father and stared wide-eyed as more riders emerged behind the first group until the ridge itself seemed lined with horses. Whitmore removed his hat slowly without realizing he had done it. One deputy whispered under his breath, "Good Lord." Malcolm Reed's expression hardened instantly. "This is unnecessary," he snapped toward Dakota. Dakota ignored him completely. The old Apache man simply watched the riders approach with the tired calm of someone watching family return home after a long journey. There were at least 30 by the time the first horse reached the ranch gate. Then 40. Some carried rifles across their saddles. Others carried nothing but blankets and medicine bags tied beside their horses. No war paint, no raised weapons, only silence. The lead rider finally guided his horse forward through the snow and stopped near the porch. He was younger than Elias expected, broad-shouldered, dark braided hair streaked lightly with gray near the temples. Around his neck hung a silver medallion stamped with the same symbol Elias had seen pressed into the bank telegram seal. The rider looked down toward Dakota and placed one closed fist over his heart. "Uncle," he said quietly. Dakota nodded once. "You came quickly, Daniel." Daniel's eyes moved across the yard carefully before stopping on Malcolm Reed. The warmth disappeared from his face immediately. "You followed him here." Reed brushed snow from his black gloves calmly. "I followed stolen property." Daniel almost smiled at that. "The courts will enjoy hearing you explain which part belonged to you." Elias stood frozen beside Clara while the strange morning unfolded around him like a dream he could not fully understand. Whitmore finally cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mr. Mercer," he said softly, "I was not informed your guest had connections to the Red River Council." Elias gave a dry, tired laugh. "Neither was I." Dakota stepped closer to Elias then and slowly removed the silver pocket watch from inside his coat once more. He pressed it gently into the rancher's hand. Elias frowned immediately. "What is this for?" Dakota closed Elias's fingers around the watch. "My father carried it through 3 winters when soldiers burned villages farther west." His voice remained calm and low beneath the drifting snow. "He gave it to me before he died and said one thing." Elias looked down at the worn silver case resting against his rough palm. "What did he say?" Dakota's tired eyes shifted toward Clara standing beside the porch wrapped tightly in her blanket. "He said a starving man who still shares his food is wealthier than kings." Silence settled softly across the ranch yard. Even the horses seemed still now. Daniel reached inside his saddlebag and pulled free another folded document sealed with heavy wax. He handed it toward Elias carefully. "This is the deed transfer for 40 head of cattle and winter feed purchased in your name this morning." Elias stared at him speechless. "I cannot accept this." Daniel shook his head gently. You already did. Elias looked confused until Dakota nodded toward the cabin behind him, toward the empty bowls still sitting beside the fire. Last night, the old man said quietly, you fed a stranger before feeding yourself. Elias felt his throat tighten painfully. He looked toward Clara, then back toward the snow-covered ranch stretching silent beneath the morning sky. 7 years of fear, gone overnight, not because of luck, not because of force, because one hungry man knocked on the wrong door at exactly the right moment. Malcolm Reed watched the exchange with cold disbelief before turning sharply toward his horse. This is not finished. Daniel's voice stopped him before he could mount. No, he said calmly. It finally is. Spring arrived slowly across Elias Mercer's ranch that year. Snow melted from the fence lines 1 quiet inch at a time while cold wind gave way to softer mornings carrying the smell of wet earth and fresh grass. By April, cattle moved again through the pasture where winter had nearly buried everything Elias owned. The broken barn roof had been repaired with fresh timber. Smoke rose steady from the chimney each morning. And for the first time in years, the Mercer Ranch no longer looked like a place waiting to die. Some evenings, Elias still sat alone on the porch after sunset, with Abigail's old blanket folded beside him and the silver pocket watch resting warm in his hands. He never carried it into town, never tried to sell it. Some things stopped belonging to money after enough years passed through them. Clara had changed too. The careful hunger disappeared from her face little by little. She laughed more now, slept easier. Sometimes Elias caught her humming softly while feeding chickens near the barn, and every single time it startled him because the sound reminded him so much of her mother that it hurt in the gentlest way possible. Word about the winter morning spread farther than Elias ever expected. Ranchers talked. Store owners talked more. Before long, half the county knew the story about the bankrupt cattleman who fed an Apache stranger during a blizzard and woke up debt-free by sunrise. Most folks added pieces that never happened. Some said 50 warriors surrounded the ranch. Others claimed hidden gold was buried somewhere beneath the barn. Elias never corrected them. Truth usually traveled quieter than rumors out west. One afternoon near the end of April, Whitmore himself rode back to the ranch alone. No deputies, no papers, just one tired banker wearing the same black coat beneath a warmer sky. Elias found him standing silently beside the repaired fence watching Clara laugh while chasing chickens through the yard. Looks different now, Whitmore said quietly. Elias nodded once. Feels different too. The banker removed his gloves slowly. I spent 30 years believing wealth belonged to men who held on to things. He glanced toward the ranch house where sunlight touched the windows. Turns out it may belong to men willing to give things away instead. Elias almost smiled at that. Whitmore looked uncomfortable for a long moment before speaking again. I misjudged you, Mercer. Elias leaned against the fence rail. Most people did. Whitmore gave a small tired nod, then reached inside his coat and removed the original debt papers. Without ceremony, he handed them over. Elias stared at the documents that had haunted 7 years of his life. The ink looked smaller somehow now, weaker. Whitmore pulled a match from his pocket and held it out silently. Elias looked at the papers one final time before striking the match against the fence post. Flame curled slowly through the edges while wind carried gray ash across the pasture. Neither man spoke while the debt disappeared into smoke. Far off near the western ridge, a lone rider appeared briefly against the evening sun. Dark horse, quiet posture, watching from a distance. Elias already knew who it was before Clara shouted excitedly from the yard. By the time he looked again, the rider had vanished beyond the hills like part of the fading light itself. That night, Elias sat at the dinner table beside Clara while stew simmered thick and warm across the stove. Real meat this time. Fresh bread too. Clara smiled while filling his bowl first. Elias looked at the steam rising from the food and remembered the storm. The empty shelves. The last meal. One quiet knock against the door. He stared at the fire for a long moment before finally speaking softly into the silence. Funny thing about kindness out here, he said. Clara looked up curiously. Elias smiled faintly while the wind moved gently beyond the windows. Most people think it disappears into the cold. He glanced toward the dark prairie stretching endless beneath the stars. But sometimes, it comes riding back.